Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Robert Hudec Lecture on this second day of the SIEL Conference on Rethinking Global Economic Governance. My name is Dan Hohnstein. I am an editor of TradeLawGuide, which is one of the sponsors of the conference. It is my privilege to provide the introduction to the Robert Hudec Lecture and its participants, including Professor Mary Footer, who will provide the lecture, and Professors James Gathii and Ratton Sanchez Badin, who will interview Professor Footer as part of this evening's program. I would like to remind everyone that this lecture is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the SIEL conference platform for all registered delegates to view later. And I understand that it may also be published on the SIEL YouTube channel. As many of you know, this lecture commemorates one of the titans of international economic theory and trade law. Bob Hudec is recognized as one of the founders, together with John Jackson, of the academic study and development of international trade law. In the analytical approach that he developed, Bob Hudec valued the utility of binding rules and a dispute settlement system with the authority to interpret and apply those rules. But he also recognized the pragmatism and therefore the importance of allowing sufficient flexibility for diplomacy and even political contributions to remain a part of the formula. His work has helped to shape the role of international law in establishing rules-based systems for governing international trade and investment, particularly in the forms of the WTO and its predecessor, the GATT. Professor Footer and I were discussing Bob Hudec's legacy the other day and how it relates to the topic of today's lecture. I would like to share one item of her insight from that discussion, which really struck me. She explained that, in her view, Bob Hudec's legacy is to remind us of the importance of law in action. And this is crucially important as we begin our journey out from under the shadow of the global COVID-19 pandemic. We find that some things have changed and other things have not. Governments, industries, and individuals in countries across different levels of development are adapting to new normalities, and these can mean different things to different people in different places. At the same time, they are continuing to grapple with critical economic issues like growing inequality and climate change. In these circumstances, there are clearly some tremendous challenges ahead in terms of the global economy and local responses to it. Assessing how the international trade law in action can best help to address these challenges, well, that's what Bob Hudec's legacy is all about. With that, please allow me to introduce today's participants in the lecture. Mary Footer is Professor Emerita of International Economic Law at the University of Nottingham. And she is also the former co-director of the Nottingham International Law and Security Center. Professor Footer has also taught at the University of Amsterdam, the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and University College London. In addition, she has been a visiting professor and a visiting scholar at many universities and institutions throughout the world. Throughout her career, Professor Footer has published widely on matters of international economic law and governance, business and human rights, biotechnology, and food security, especially in the developing country context. In the 90s, she was a full-time senior program legal counsel at the International Development Law Organization located in Rome. She is currently the chair of the International Law Association Committee on Sustainable Development and the Green Economy in International Trade Law. Interviewing Professor Footer this evening are Professors James Gathii and Ratton Sanchez Badin. James Gathii is a professor of law and the Wing Tat Lee Chair in International Law at the Loyola University School of Law in Chicago. He is a graduate of the University of Nairobi and of Harvard Law School. His research and teaching interests cover an impressive scope similar to that of Professor Footer, including public international law, international trade law, third world approaches to international law, comparative constitutionalism, human rights, and business law. Professor Gathii has been an arbitrator in international commercial arbitrations hosted by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and he currently sits on the China International Economic and Trade Arbitration Commission. He is an elected member of the Academy of International Law, and he has consulted for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Economic Commission for Africa. Michel Ratton Sanchez Badin is a professor at FGV Sao Paulo School of Law in Brazil, including in the Law and Development Postgraduate Program. She is the coordinator of the FGV Center of Global Law and Development and the WTO chair in Brazil. She is the director of the Red Latino-Americano de Derecho Económico Internacional and of the Brazilian chapter of the International Law Association. She is also a founding member of SIEL. In terms of format, today's lecture will consist of 3 parts. To start, Professor Footer will provide an opening lecture of about 20 minutes or so. After this, as advertised in the program, Professor Footer will be interviewed by Professors Gathii and Ratton Sanchez Badin. Finally, there will be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions and engage in the discussion. With that, we welcome you, Professor Footer, to the virtual stage.
Good afternoon, good evening, and to some of you, good morning. Thank you very much, Dan. It is with great pleasure and an honor to be invited to give the 2021, although it is supposedly the 2020, Robert Hudec lecture. I will be speaking on the topic of people, place, and time as determinants of international economic relations. And my aim in the lecture is to be both backward-looking in terms of people and forward-looking in terms of place, and sometimes both together. I will reflect on a year and a half of COVID-19 and vaccine nationalism, with the phenomena of disrupted supply chains and unprecedented state intervention in national economies. In terms of place, I will be forward-looking in asking whether the pandemic could help us to tackle climate change and to embrace sustainability in ongoing efforts to reform international trade and finance. The third determinant, time, is a variable with enduring elasticity. It can act as a brake or as an accelerator, dependent on people and place, in determining the course of international economic relations. I will begin with the determinant of people. The starkest reality of people is the toll that the novel coronavirus has had, like other plagues and pandemics, on people's lives globally in the past year. It was ever so. The historian Simon Sharma recalls that once upon a time, a plague, one like the bubonic plague or the Black Death, was a square dance along a quadrilateral formed by political power, economic desperation, religious fervor, and medical understanding. Today, the 4 corners of the COVID-19 pandemic are marked in the political realm by growing authoritarianism, economic opportunism, digital, often disinformation, and scientific knowledge. I will come on to explain what I mean by economic opportunism, which in the current pandemic manifests itself in the procurement of personal protection equipment, PPE, testing, and vaccinations. Meanwhile, the issue of place remains relevant. For many in the developing world, COVID-19 highlights economic desperation and growing inequality. In the political realm, the past year has seen governments of all political persuasion, from democratic to autocratic, pursue more statist policies in the face of the pandemic, while some have sought to increase their power through authoritarianism. One only has to look at the likes of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Jair Bolsonaro, Rodrigo Duterte, and former US President Donald Trump. Disinformation, particularly the digital dissemination of information and disinformation, threatens to undermine human rights, democratic institutions, and development processes, And a very recent report by Irene Khan to the UN Human Rights Council as UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression recalls very vividly this important issue of disinformation, and it's having an incredible effect on international economic relations too. Because as a result of disinformation, governments and health authorities have often disseminated information unevenly to their constituencies, and it has led people to respond differently to lockdowns, quarantine, and vaccination rollouts. Above all, as the coronavirus has spread and mutated, and the search for a vaccine has intensified, scientific knowledge has come under pressure in every corner of the world. Time has proven critical, both in the rapid spread of COVID-19 and the failure of the international community, be it the WHO or individual governments, to declare a global pandemic sooner. Similarly, time has proven of the essence in fast-tracking the development, approval, and manufacture or production of key vaccines, the three big ones being Pfizer, BioNTech, AstraZeneca, and Moderna, which provide some protection against the novel coronavirus. However, my emphasis in this lecture is primarily on the economic aspects of the pandemic and what it can teach us in terms of people and place. I begin with the determinant people because it is people who contribute to the production of goods and services for domestic and foreign consumption. Labour and employment markets retain a vital importance in all societies, irrespective of their level of economic development. Governments remain in power based on the strength of employment figures and rely on labour to produce public goods such as law enforcement and national security. States are measured according to their gross domestic product. When a global pandemic like COVID-19 strikes, the importance of people is tested as never before. The growth and spread of COVID-19, leaving no state or territory, not even Antarctica, free from its grip, has pitted labour and employment markets against the interests of public health. In the absence of adequate planning for a novel coronavirus pandemic, states have been faced, and many are still faced, with inadequate healthcare facilities to deal with the pandemic. Governments have sought to maximise the domestic availability of critical products to combat the coronavirus. As the pandemic unfolded, there was a sharp increase in global demand by countries eager to source medical supplies and PPE, personal protection equipment, for their people. Back in March 2020, the G20 trade ministers stressed that emergency measures designed to tackle COVID-19 must be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to global supply chains. In other words, they should be consistent with WTO rules on quantitative restrictions. In fact, over the last year, just from reading the WTO website, it's very clear that WTO member notifications for goods, services, and IP protection reveal that many governments have used a mixture of export controls and import liberalization or trade facilitating measures in a rush to secure medical supplies and PPE, face masks, respirators, and so on. However, in doing so, public procurement rules were frequently set aside on national security grounds, including the failure to sometimes, and quite often in fact, to verify the source or cost of those emergency supplies. Occasionally, absurd levels of economic opportunism were involved when sourcing from the private sector. There has also been belatedly an attempt to put in place a WTO TRIPS waiver on vaccines, not entirely successful at this juncture, although there are plans at the moment afoot to revise the text to make it a time-limited waiver of 3 years and to scale back some of the other clauses in the this is India, South Africa, and so on, that have put forward the TRIPS waiver. However, there is still strong opposition to it from countries with interested pharmaceutical industries. One only has to look at the European Union, the United States, and even World Bank Director David Malpass coming out against the TRIPS waiver as recently as the beginning of June. This is still a work in action, unfortunately, and the path towards the waiver actually replicates and resembles very much the previous access to medicines, TRIPS and access to medicines waiver that we saw at the turn of the century. Time has played a significant role in the global pandemic, and it has reduced trade flows. Both global value chains and production networks have been disrupted, beginning with the declaration of the G20 leaders, trade ministers I mentioned previously, but seaborne container traffic also has been affected. In fact, seaborne container traffic has been very problematic and has undermined the economic system to some extent. It was compounded by the occurrence of a so-called black swan incident in March of this year, when the Suez Canal, which facilitates around 15% of international shipping annually, was blocked for 6 days by a 400-meter-long container ship, impeding the progress of an estimated 422 other vessels. But once again, we have a stark reminder of the reach of the global pandemic along supply chains. With a recent coronavirus outbreak, this time the Delta variant in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, which has slowed the flow of container traffic at Shenzhen's Yantian port, which is one of the world's busiest container terminals. The geography of COVID-19 means that each twist and turn of the pandemic has led to greater inequality both within and outside national borders. And here the determinant place becomes relevant. Throughout 2020, many developed country governments encouraged or even told people to down tools or to work from home during local and national lockdowns. But for many people in the developing world, or those working in the informal sector, the unregulated sector of advanced economies, it is necessary to work to live, often in distant towns or in crowded environments. The rapid spread of the coronavirus, combined with the lack of political will by national governments to address the impact of the pandemic in some developing countries like Brazil, India, Peru, and the Philippines, has led to many more people dying from corona than is necessary. While the COVID-19 pandemic is foremost a public health crisis, it has also caused substantial damage to the global economy. National governments are spending trillions of dollars to fight the negative economic impact of corona, including subsidizing furlough schemes and the housing market, while doing little or nothing to stave off inflationary effects, the effects of the higher cost of goods and transportation, which will eventually arise. However, until the major vaccines for COVID-19 have been more widely distributed and greater levels of immunity against the virus and its mutations exist, physical distancing measures will continue to affect key sectors of the global economy negatively, especially those that rely on close physical proximity between people. Widespread economic opportunism prevails in the manufacture and distribution of both state-of-the-art testing for COVID and vaccines. Unfortunately, when it comes to vaccinating their people, national governments tend to follow their own interests rather than pursuing a more globally coordinated approach. This is having negative consequences on how well the global pandemic is managed and contained, particularly in the developing world, where vaccine availability and take-up is still haphazard, incomplete, or in conflict zones like Syria has not even commenced. The experience of the COVID Vaccines Access, or COVAX facility, launched by the World Health Organization, the European Commission, and France in response to COVID-19 is revealing. Many countries, including some EU member states, have disregarded their earlier commitments to the COVAX facility in the race to have their people vaccinated as quickly as possible in the hope that their economies would return to normal levels by the end of 2021. Any hope that the COVAX facility might serve as Anna-Marie Slaughter and Gordon Laforge have suggested that it might serve as a prototype for an issue-specific international organization which could act as a problem-solving networked hub in the global order. Those ideas appear to be misplaced. Even so, a group of like-minded WTO members, Australia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, New Zealand, Norway, and Turkey, have pressed for an international effort to promote the rapid, global, and equitable distribution of affordable, safe, and effective COVID-19 related medical products and vaccines. They have also backed the idea of the WTO contributing to global efforts along the lines of the COVAX facility. I've already mentioned the TRIPS waiver. We may have some discussion on that in due course. In terms of world trade, as the WTO itself has reported in its annual report, there's been an economic downturn, but it's not been as bad or not as materialized to the extent that was originally feared. Over the past year, trade in merchandise goods declined by 5.3% compared to a projected drop of 9.2%. The better than expected outcome was mainly due to the quick action by many governments in providing fiscal and monetary support to help mitigate some of the negative effects of the pandemic, limiting the drop in global demand. The worry is that the relatively positive short-term outlook for global trade is damaged by regional disparities, continued weakness in services trade, and lagging vaccination timetables, particularly for people in poorer developing countries. Again, time can act as a brake or as an accelerator. A resurgence of COVID-19 among people anywhere, or the spread of vaccine-resistant strains of the virus, require new local or national lockdowns, which could reduce global GDP growth by 1% and cut merchandise trade by 2% this year alone. I want to turn in the remainder of this lecture and to consider whether the experience of the global pandemic could help in tackling climate change and give a push to sustainability as part of a package to reform international trade and finance. The main determinant here is place, although our anthropocentric approach to climate change and sustainability ensures that people remain front and center. There are significant differences in people's perceptions and understanding of climate change when we compare that to the COVID-19 pandemic. Most people believe the global pandemic presents a clear and present danger to their lives and their livelihoods. By contrast, climate change is seen by many people as presenting a diffuse and future danger. However, unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, there is no quick fix for climate change, nor seemingly is there an overriding desire on the part of states to act decisively and collectively to reduce CO2 emissions. The global pandemic has demonstrated that international cooperation is possible, but time is the essential factor. Teams of scientists supported by global leaders have worked across national and regional boundaries in an accelerated time frame to develop vaccines to address the threat that COVID-19 possesses. Those same global leaders are only slowly coming round to fighting climate change, which when it comes to place is everywhere. And yet, climate change like COVID-19 will lead to extensive loss of life, unemployment, and substantial decline in GDP globally. Whereas vaccines against COVID will eventually build immunity among people, possibly leading to it becoming a form of seasonal flu, the place of climate change and its consequences on the global economy will persist and last longer unless states act in solidarity to confront it. Consequential changes in weather patterns and sea level rise mean that a major aim of the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2% and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5% is not looking attainable. Again, in terms of place, many countries are not evenly sensitized or capable of responding to the emerging crisis of climate change. Additionally, international shipping could represent some 10% of greenhouse gases within a few years. Here again, time is a key determinant. While the International Maritime Organization plans to adopt stronger CO2 emissions targets, they're not due until 2023, ensuring compatibility with the Paris Agreement. But to date, it has been very slow to develop policy. Instead, in terms of action, the IMO has focused primarily on requiring shipping companies to increase their vessels' energy efficiency, for example, by encouraging slow steaming. Besides, while efforts to reduce carbon emissions may be a common aim among many countries, the burden of doing so will not be shared equally. And here the place of carbon emissions in different parts of the world becomes relevant too. In many developing countries, the need to implement policies which shift the economy away from carbon-intensive industries must continue to compete with the priority of economic growth and poverty alleviation. According to the International Energy Agency, emerging markets and developing country economies account for more than 2/3 of global CO2 emissions, while those in advanced economies are in structural decline, despite an anticipated 4% rebound in 2021. The problem begins with the failure of the international community to treat climate change as a public good and to act collectively to reduce CO2 emissions. This stands in contrast to the approach of those in the private sector, including NGOs and concerned citizens, who have mounted public interest litigation against big oil, gas and coal, beginning with the crowd-funded Agenda Foundation case against the Dutch government in 2019, the recent decision of Friends of the Earth Europe versus Royal Dutch Shell, calling for a corporation to lower its carbon emissions in May 2021, and an Australian court ruling that the Federal Environment Minister, when deciding whether or not to approve a new coal mine, owes a duty of care to young people to avoid causing them personal injury from climate change. Similarly, people have been at the center of private investor action, which has manifested itself at ExxonMobil, where a majority of shareholders delivered a sharp rebuke to management by voting in 2 new directors proposed by activist hedge fund Engine No. 1. Meanwhile, shareholders at Chevron have called for the corporation to substantially reduce CO2 emissions from its products. But public interest litigation and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investor action, are a step in the right direction, but they are insufficient on their own. There must be a collective response from governments to act to avert the risk of global climate change. It is up to governments, many of which have signed up to the major agreements, including the Paris Agreement, to act under the banner of global trade and finance to find ways of doing this in a coordinated fashion, including broader cooperation with transnational actors. The financial sector is aware of an underestimated environmental catastrophe which may arise from climate change. In other words, a large-scale, high-impact or green swan event connected to global warming and the impacts of pollution, neither of which, by the way, is place-specific. Rather, a green swan event could trigger a systemic financial crisis with global implications on the scale of the 2008 financial crisis. Central banks, under the auspices of the Bank for International Settlements, are working on a set of new climate risk disclosure rules and an international implementation framework for COP26, which will be held later on in November of this year. For many central bankers, the issue of climate change is intertwined with that of rising inflation. In terms of place, countries are taking steps to align COVID-19 recovery packages with climate and decarbonization priorities. Here, time is a factor because the pandemic has accelerated rather than slowed down the momentum for moving towards decarbonization. Further developments are not expected until the last quarter of this year. The network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, or the NGFS, will have to better incorporate the effects of climate change on economic modelling, including dealing with the issue of carbon pricing, as well as the effect of emissions trading and carbon offset schemes, and to develop a stress test methodology that operates alongside and is compatible with the Basel IV capital requirements for banks. I say this because it may seem that everything is going on at central bank level, but if we have this stress test methodology in terms of climate change, that sets the standard also for commercial banking and for lending by the commercial banking sector. So it's very important, actually. The importance of regulating the place of the corporate sector, I think, deserves attention. On the one hand, we know that despite government pledges to build back greener, we've just had the G7 meeting in the UK and the same G7 slogan, and to cut carbon emissions, we do know that more than half of the US $327 billion in COVID recovery funds that has been provided by G7 countries to energy producing and consuming countries was for oil, gas, and coal. In other words, for the fossil fuel industry. Often those funds have been provided to corporations without any strings attached. In other words, without any demands being made on them to reduce their carbon footprint. From a trade perspective, and I'll switch here towards the multilateral trading system, there are ongoing negotiations at the WTO to deal with prohibiting subsidies. Work has been going on for several years now on fisheries subsidies to deal with the threat of this and to provide sustainability of fishing and to ensure the sustainable use and conservation of the marine environment. Those multi-institutional negotiations, also involving the FAO and so on, are very important because they could provide an important template for dealing with something like fossil fuel subsidies, basically reducing or removing them altogether. There are also a myriad of issues in domestic green trade policies that could be dealt with or developed further at the bilateral level, plurilaterally, or in a multilateral frame. Some are already ongoing policies that prohibit or restrict environmentally harmful behavior. I've mentioned fisheries subsidies. Maybe we will see some prohibition on fossil fuel subsidies, but also things that allow for greener choices in the form of border tax adjustment measures, carbon taxes, and emissions trading schemes. A lot still hangs on whether things can be done at the international level because the set of rules that need to be agreed on implementing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are still have still not been concluded, and we have no heads up as to a multilateral approach there. There are also other areas where domestic green trade policy could give us a steer in the transfer of environmentally sound technologies, also in trade on environmental goods. In fact, back in 2014, a group of like-minded countries led by Canada and the Canadian delegation to the WTO actually pioneered an environmental goods agreement. It has largely been left to one side, wasn't dealt with in any great detail, but may yet see a new life, that may yet take off. The global pandemic has focused attention on the need for sustainable economic recovery. Prior to COVID-19, green, sustainable, and social bonds, ESG bonds, were already gaining ground. Currently, they are seen as an important financial instrument for countries to catalyze green and sustainable recovery projects to achieve net zero emissions. Green capital markets can play a critical role in providing funds to accelerate the development of green projects, including their place in the emerging and developing world. Again, the extent to which the place of substantial green investment globally could be matched by developments in the multilateral trading system is open to question, although I've mentioned some areas where it could be developed further. However, the urgency of the situation has been noted by a large group of WTO members in a communication on trade and environmental sustainability in November 2020. The most significant issues raised in that communication are that trade and environmental objectives and policy should be mutually supportive. This is nothing new. It was in the Doha Ministerial Declaration. It's just that there's been no real effect given to it. International trade and trade policy as key enablers of the transition towards a climate neutral, resource efficient, circular global economy need to support global efforts towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Another point is that the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated the need to diversify and strengthen the resilience and sustainability of global supply chains to ensure stability of trade in the face of global challenges. So not just pandemics like COVID-19, but other risks, climate risks being the most important one for this purpose. And perhaps most significantly, hidden in one of its paragraphs, the communication states that environmental sustainability should be one of the guiding principles of the wider reform of the WTO. In other words, sustainability should be an organizing principle of WTO reform. So what would that mean in practice? And taking the idea of law in action, this is Hudec's motto, the idea here would be to put sustainable development and sustainability at the very heart of reforming the multilateral trading system. So instead of tinkering around the edges with agreements and exceptions and so forth, we work with perhaps policy-based instruments to develop a more rounded approach and a coordinated and cohesive approach among the WTO members to green or to provide a steer as to how the organization could lead on sustainable development and a green economy and bring some order to the multilateral. Potentially that would filter back down or could be filtered back up from domestic economies into the WTO. I think I'll stop at this point. There are many other things I could say, including some points about the services trade, which is very underrepresented. Also the potential role of medium and small and medium-sized enterprises in the trading system, which is beginning to gain some ground. But I think for the purposes of this lecture, I will conclude here. So thank you very much.
Okay, if I may jump in. As part of SIEL community, I'd like to thank you, Mary Filter, for such insightful thoughts for our conversation today, honoring Professor Hudec. Your lecture, after our many hours in front of our computers, connect us to the emergencies the outside world is bleeding from our works in the international economic law community. How can we address such emergencies from our field of work and to promote a change in people's behavior? I'd like to start thinking about part of the contribution of Southern ideas to the current crisis involves invoking diverse perceptions from around the world. I call here a Brazilian anthropologist that frames his work as from the Amazonian culture, Viveiros de Castro, together with a native philosopher in Brazil, Ailton Krenak, for whom place and people are people and people are places. The proposal is to change our perspectives and epistemologies, aiming at, as Krenak says, postponing the end of the world. In Latin American culture, for example, the notion of Pachamama means that place, earth, and human beings are part of the same organic being. And I'm sure other cultures have similar inspirational concepts to provide us with. But this calls for a change in our perspective, and our concern should be about the epistemological challenge for our international economic law system. While the transnational approach of your work may indeed help us in breaking the boundaries and tenets of international cooperation undertaken exclusively by state actors and international agreements, what would you say are the elements already in place for this kind of change of epistemologies? This is my first question to you.
Okay, I find this a very intriguing question. I really like your analogy, your description of the work of the Brazilian anthropologist and philosopher who both have pointed out that people and place are really the same thing. They're inseparable. And I think that's very important. I'm sure that's true in many other cultural situations, many other belief spheres. But to come to your very precise question on transnational approaches, I've been giving this a little bit of thought, and I have, from my work on business and human rights, I think actually the UN guiding principles on business and human rights developed in 2011 by John Ruggie, otherwise known as the Ruggie Principles, can perhaps guide us a little bit in this direction. For those of you who are aware of the guiding principles, they include 3 pillars. The first pillar deals with obligations of the state, because we're dealing with human rights. So one could think in this context of maybe the obligations of states for sustainability, their obligations in the sphere of climate change, particularly under the Paris Agreement. And then the second pillar deals with the corporate responsibility to protect. And since corporations have come very much on board, particularly in the finance sphere, but I think also potentially in the trade sphere too, they are relevant actors. And we're here talking about an actorness that's very different when we talk about transnational relations. It would be, we could potentially think of an involvement of states that are obviously parties to multilateral treaties, environmental treaties and others, but also having corporations involved, also civil society, NGOs, in moving this agenda forward and taking action on it. And also, the third pillar, of course, in the Ruggie principles is the remedial part. And one could also think of how remedy could be brought in. It wouldn't work perhaps so well with the WTO dispute settlement, but maybe it could. Maybe it could be considered as a potential forum. I think there are some, it's a very interesting concept that Ruggie developed when he put this forward to the business on business and human rights. And as I say, it may prove to be something of a useful template for this area too. And it forms part of, I suppose, this sort of global network governance approach, also something towards a sort of multi-stakeholder approach in the field of multilateralism, about which I've also been doing some work. So thank you, Michelle.
So I joined Professor Badin in congratulating you on such an excellent lecture, Professor Foot, and also to thank you for your very important work in international economic law, and in particular for being such an inspirational supervisor for so many students, including Timothy Masiko, who just won the SIEL Hart Prize. It's really great to see that. So for my first question, it's a people question. You argue that that many in the developing world, COVID-19 highlights economic desperation and growing inequality. And you also noted in the global north as well, those working in the informal sector and in distant places and crowded environments. And we could add that people in agricultural supply chains have been most adversely affected. I think it is now common knowledge that the people that are most affected by this pandemic, both in the global north and the global south, are racial minorities. It's the case both in terms of infections as well in terms of access to the vaccines and the PPEs as well. So my first question is COVID-19 not telling us as international economic lawyers to actually talk more transparently about the people that are mostly adversely affected by bringing race to the center of the conversation? My colleague, Professor Matiangai Salif argues, some lives, it seems, are disposable when it comes to talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. And so my first question is about sort of the transparency with which we talk and to disaggregate the category of people so that we're not just talking about inequality in general terms, but in much more granular ways, as perhaps one way to think about how to start thinking and resolving the consequences of this pandemic.
It could be. I would hesitate to put I won't call it a label, but to put the term racial out there. It may also affect some of those who have a white skin. It may also affect, and I think we often forget this, the many undocumented workers, undocumented migrants, the majority of whom may be of color, but maybe not. And I think it would be worth examining. One thing I didn't mention, but of course it is very relevant, is the issue of migration, which has seen an upsurge. And we've had migration from COVID hotspots. We're going to get even more migration when we have the adverse effects of climate change in some parts of the world. This is very, but it is true that in the informal sector of many advanced economies, the UK is a good example, but there are others in Europe and North America where people are working in unregulated situations, in factories and so forth. Many of them have come into the economies from maybe through family links. They may not have their papers in order and so forth, and they therefore find themselves in these situations, and they have to work to continue to stay and to live. But it does seem also that as the COVID pandemic has moved along throughout the last year, that once again, it is many of the countries in the South, many of the Southern Hemisphere in particular, of many different racial groupings. Sometimes I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the West, if you like, the access to vaccines. It can also be the lead by political leaders, or the lack of political will to recognize and to deal with the COVID situation. I'm thinking in particular of India, or to act too late. But we have also seen that, by the way, in some countries, even in the United States. So that's a little bit of a difficult one. But I do think, to move away from the racial part, I do think the issue of accessibility to vaccines needs to we need to pay much more attention to that. Who is getting the vaccine, and on what basis and when and at what cost. That's very important.
Great. Michelle, if you allow me, there's a follow-up question from the chat, from the audience, and it's from Lothar Ehring. Should we also speak about gender in this context, given that COVID mortality is gender asymmetric?
Thank you, Lothar. That's a very, yes, I know Lothar. That's a good question. It's difficult to know the extent to which women are affected, women and other groups. I suspect as time moves on, we will get a better picture of this. In quite a few European countries and some other parts of the world, there's been an increase in domestic violence. That's a completely different story, of course. But as to whether women are being affected more, I don't know. I'm not sure of the evidence yet. But I do believe that will come out at some point.
I'd like to go back to this idea of different people that James just brought to us, and thinking about the different places, because if we take the different waves of globalization we experienced in the past centuries, based on the modern state rationality, the displacement of problems and promotion of unequal distribution has been part of the logic of integration. In your view, what do you think is needed in terms of new authorities beyond the idea of adding states plus firms plus civil society, new authority models to reframe this logic and to promote what you call as people-oriented transnational approach, irrespective of place?
I think rather than talking about a new authority, I would say new governance models. And it could be, but they're quite tricky to manage, some form of multi-stakeholderism. And this is where you have a wider group of actors that are involved in making laws, making rules, also are significantly active and relevant for the implementation of them. So possibly, I do think the future is about is transnational law, or transnationalism. It's already there. And I think we need to spend more time and more effort understanding the relationship of transnationalism with international law and international economic law, because much of transnational law and governance is economic anyway. So I think there's plenty of work, there's plenty of scholarship on this already, and probably more forthcoming. But I do think that's probably the direction we should be going in. And having a better system of checks and balances. One thing that's come out in the pandemic, and mostly it's because of the emergency regimes in many countries that having to source PPE or vaccines or production of vaccines, we've seen a lack of checks and on that exercise of power and of authority, and a lot of corruption. That's increased significantly, and everywhere, including in the developed world as well. So we've got huge challenges ahead of us. Yeah.
Great. So your lecture talked about the possibility of a green swan event that would trigger a financial crisis, and that immediately equivalent to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And that immediately led me to thinking that perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic has already triggered that kind of a global economic crisis, particularly in the context of sovereign debt. the most indebted countries have a much larger debt burden because their scarce resources are competing between addressing the immediate needs called upon to address. They're called upon to address the COVID-19 pandemic, like you spoke about in your lecture, but also to repay creditors. And this time, the creditors include lots of private creditors who are not interested in sort of the kind of Paris Club arrangements. And I wanted to ask you to say a few things about whether you see this as another of the systemic risks that's related to your point about the financial downturn, this one event that you spoke about in your lecture.
I think it's linked and it's not linked. Well, this is an effort by the financial community and at least the central banks to try and avert a green swan event. But in terms of developing country indebtedness, I think in my view, there needs to be a much stronger steer from the multilateral, from the international financial institutions, World Bank and IMF, to basically, it could be a new program of debt forgiveness, or it could be new means of lending or grant facilities. It has to be something, but I think here again, states and probably, I think, through the financial institutions have got to step up to the plate and really deal with this. And one thing I also find quite troubling is there is still, to this day, insufficient attention given to human rights and indebtedness. And that is something that neither the IMF nor the World Bank is sufficiently prepared to engage with. We have a special rapporteur on this. At the moment, it's Michael Fakhri. And yet, it's still not really being addressed. But it is. I think you've hit on a very important point, James, because these heavily indebted low and middle income countries, it's going to take them even longer and require even more resources in order to repay existing loans. Many of them are having to borrow from the commercial sector, although that is nothing new. The other thing that is troubling, I think, is that the World Bank is currently using the IFC, that's its private sector lending arm, more extensively than it has been doing in the past. And that doesn't augur very well either. So I think I'll leave it there, but I think that's, we do need some changes.
If I may just follow up, one of the, you spoke quite powerfully about the importance of international cooperation to resolve these challenges. And to resolve the challenges in the international financial system, you placed a lot of emphasis, including in your response just now, on the Bretton Woods institutions, on the international financial institutions. One of the proposals for unlocking the stalemate on reform, that the United States has a veto on IMF quota reform, and it blocked the most recent effort to have quota reform. And the next quota reform is coming up in 2023, I believe. But even then, it may not. It's unlikely that the U.S. will want to drop its veto. So the prospects for global financial reform seem quite dim. And I don't want to ask you a dim question, but this is the reality we are confronting if we have to rely entirely on the will of governments to confront these challenges. And perhaps this then goes back to Professor Badin's initial question about sort of thinking about other ways of making sure those reforms happen through the kind of movements that we've seen on racial justice that have led to major changes, although certainly there's been resistance.
Mm-hmm. James, are you suggesting perhaps that social justice movements might, perhaps not in racial justice, but social justice movements might perhaps provide a kind of lead here, or?
Yeah, I think, I'm sort of wondering aloud and thinking along with you. We have seen that major changes to the global economic system have only happened when there's been sustained pressure, not just from the states, but from the people.
Yeah. Yes.
And so a focus only on states, I think, which we as international economic lawyers are often likely to focus on, misses out the other players, the people, who, however you define the people, as sort of the places where some of the pressure might come from, and until governments feel the pressure that perhaps these reforms cannot be only put at the feet of governments. We've seen that with decolonization or any of the other major shifts in international relations has not happened just because governments wanted to, but because there were movements beyond governments that were pushing governments. The same way private actors are pushing governments to safeguard their interests within the international economic system.
Would you go so far as to think that we need something like another new international economic order? I wouldn't say necessarily so, or necessarily within the UN context, but perhaps it would or could be within that. And I mean, the one thing I think is very glaringly obvious is the principle of solidarity is missing. It's just not there among governments and governments in international organizations. In fact, there's been a prolonged disengagement over the last 5 years or so of governments with international organizations. Look at the World Trade Organization, how the appellate body has been dismantled. Something needs to be done to move back the other way. We need to reset the agenda. There needs to be a new balance, and there needs to be a new, maybe a new set of principles, but this principle of solidarity is absolutely critical, because without it, we're not going to be able to address the challenge of climate change. That's my view. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but...
Do we have more questions from the audience?
There's one from Peter van der Bosche. I don't know whether this is the right time to ask it. He wants us to go into China. His question is, how will increasing superpower confrontation between the United States and China affect efforts to address climate change and global health crisis?
Yeah. Very good question, Peter. Thank you very much. Very difficult. I mean, in another context, I've been writing on multi-stakeholderism in multilateral fora, and thinking about transnational actors. And I realized, of course, that when we talk about corporations, we're talking in China, we're talking about state corporations. So they have it's double hatting. They're there as governments and also as corporations. So that makes for an uneasy sort of and rather awkward and relationship, I think. But on the US-China, it's difficult to say, and it's difficult within the climate sphere, because China, in my view, tends to play both sides at the moment. So it's actively supporting the Paris Agreement, but at the same time, as Michelle has also pointed out, it is not averse to exporting its coal industry and other fossil fuels, or investing in other countries' fossil fuel industries. So in the trade sphere, we have a prolonged engagement and disengagement between the US and China. I see no immediate resolution to that other than what has been worked out under the Trump administration. It reminds me of the annual MFN renewal back in the days before China became a WTO member, that was renewed every year by the Congress. It's sort of a best behavior sort of approach. In the trade sphere, I think this is simply not going to go away. I'm not quite sure about finance. This is difficult to gauge, and I'm not quite sure whether the Belt and Road Initiative is still as active as it has been, and China is still behind it. I'd have to look to Chinese colleagues to come in on this and to respond, I suspect. But between the US and China, I don't see immediate changes there, not within the trade sphere. I hope that answered your question, Peter.
I don't know how much we have, how many minutes it remains to us, but your comment on solidarity just made me connect to what Peter just asked. When I went to Beijing to the 798 Art Zone, there was a poster that said, "We need less war and more internationalism, more solidarity." So this is pretty interesting for us, how to think in different times of our history. We need to have a new pact about the values and about the frameworks we should think about. I would just maybe ask you if you could reinforce for all those that are attending this session or will listen it later, that if it based in your previous studies that explore development models, the role of institutions and of the non-formal actors and regulations, what are the new fields of research or even new methodologies that you would like to suggest for our community to further advance in the agenda that you had proposed today, delivering more results to the outside world?
I think the agenda is probably, I should think, would be focused more specifically on climate change and sustainable development. I think that has to be front and center, at least for this decade and probably the next as well, for our children and our grandchildren. This has to be there. We've got serious issues of intergenerational equity, by the way. So what planet are we leaving to to those who come after us? And this is very important. But in terms of research, I think it's in the governance sphere. And I think it's in understanding governance models and maybe searching for a governance structure that works with these varieties of different actors. I think actorness, to quote my colleague Elaine Fahy from City University in London, is the key to understanding. So who is doing what, when, and why? And that brings us back to a people situation too. And it brings us back to Hudec's law in action, because how do we make this happen? And I think if we spend more time looking at, and maybe with empirical studies, which some of us are not so keen on doing, but rather than grand theories, if we looked at what works empirically, and finding and testing some of these governance structures, and maybe looking and working more perhaps with other formal and informal institutions to develop sound governance structures. For example, the one at the WTO, I think, is very antiquated. The committee and council system that we have within that organization, and yet at the same time, it's undervalued. I think there has been a lot of policy development and discussion among the members. It's provided a sort of cohesion. There are power struggles that go on, but I think it's produced, it hasn't led to very much yet. So the real test is researching as to how some of this work, all the work that's being done on notifications and so on, how can that be taken forward and brought to the benefit of the different WTO members, the different countries. And the other thing is much more engagement. So not just solidarity, engagement between different actors. There is a tendency for many governments to be wary of NGOs, or to be wary of the corporate sector, or for the corporate sector to be in the pocket of the government and this sort of thing. And I think that's a real challenge as well. So that brings in the question of checks and balances. What sort of remedy systems do you develop? Can you do it with soft power and soft forms of mediation and things like that? Or do you need these dispute settlements, hard dispute settlement systems with binding decisions, as we have in commercial arbitration and investment arbitration? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's the way forward, but definitely research on governance and different forms of governance.
Great. So I want to go back to your discussion about climate change. You pose a tension between economic growth on the one hand and poverty alleviation on the other. And your lecture, as you've just done in the response and discussion with Professor Badin, then centers sustainability as a very important principle. In fact, as you said, as the organizing principle perhaps for the WTO. Another lens that we could use especially populations that are most adversely affected by climate change is the lens of climate justice. That doesn't prioritize, in their view, the economy, for example. Sustainability still does center economics and all the priority gives to private property and other notions we take for granted in international economic law that may be inconsistent with the interests, for example, of indigenous peoples and local communities, La Campesina, all the movements on food sovereignty that have been campaigning for the ability to organize independently of the international economic system. You know, you mentioned the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Professor Michael Fakhri, his work on SIELs, the SIELs controversy, and the way in which the SIELs regime of the EU introduced a market that didn't exist before and that was inconsistent with lots of the indigenous communities that were sought to be helped, is a really good example of that. So my question is to challenge the lens of sustainability as the only lens with which we should think about how to resolve these questions. And what about the epistemic silencing of the sustainability lens of these alternative visions for people who may not want to participate in what we take for granted in international economic law as the inevitable good?
It's a very good point, actually, and very well articulated, because in fact, our way of doing things at the within the international economic order tend to discount cultural. It's very homogenous, and it tends to discount a lot of cultural differences and approaches and food security and sustainability and sustainable food systems, which, by the way, is a very big topic at the moment at the FAO. There'll be a major conference at the end of the year on this. Reminds us, I think, that of the small farmer, the campesino, and also that their economic endeavor or their livelihoods may be perhaps they may have different goals, and we're really imposing our values on them, and they may have very different values to us. But how to give recognition to those values and recognition to their worth, multilaterally or even unilaterally, even within governments. I think there's not enough attention paid. But how to do that? That's quite a challenge. But I think it's worth thinking about. It seems actually that within the within the community of food security, those differences and those elements are easier to understand and to work with. I think in the area of trade and finance, we haven't got there. Definitely not in trade. I mean, look at currently at trade and look at Africa. I mean, most of the exports, it's large commercial farming for export. And it's, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a WTO member or not in Africa, really. I shouldn't say that, but in many senses, you're in part of the system, but you're not part of the system. It has only limited effect, and I think something that Hudec actually said, by the way, about special and differential treatment of developing countries. He actually thought that the development of special and differential treatment, which of course has been ongoing since 1958 onwards in the Gathii system, he actually thought that could have a detrimental effect. I'm not sure I would agree with that, but on one point I do think he's right, because if you can't make those special and differential treatment provisions binding, if you can't make them bite, then they remain very inchoate, they remain very empty. And so that's another problem. So within the system, we have to look at some of the areas we already have and what's working and what's not. It probably needs a very large research project and one that has many different elements to it.
Michelle, there are two questions from the audience. Do you want me to read them for Professor Futa? Okay. So the first is from Marcus Wagner. On the topic of solidarity, he says he likes very much the concept, but what do we mean by solidarity in the international economic law context? Is there an intrinsic meaning, or does a meaningful definition of solidarity transcend the sphere of international economic law? I just want to note for Marcus, of course, there's a UN Special Rapporteur on Global Solidarity, Professor Obiora Okafor, who has done some important work there. The next question is from Dr. Kimani Goddard. How do we deal with the open, transparent, and responsible participation of the global corporate sector in international governance and lawmaking? Your favorite topic, Professor Futa, bearing in mind that their activities form a significant portion of transactions that influence sustainable development and economic and social stability. We still have about 9 minutes, so you have lots of time, Professor Futa.
Okay, thank you, James. So in terms of solidarity, this is really working, it's really the NIO idea of working together and cooperating and being part of a greater good, of actually trying to achieve something together within the field of international economic law. So it's both intrinsic and also a kind of operational principle. And I think I'll leave it there. But this idea about the open and transparent corporate sector, business sector. Of course, this has played out very much in the field of business and human rights. And finally, and it came out of the original work of John Ruggie, but has been developed further by others, the concept of due diligence has been the standard to which corporations are held in, or are, yes, they're held in when, so due diligence is used in order to discover whether corporations are consistently following human rights, are applying them in the work sphere, in all of their corporate activities, also online and so forth. But this has been worked out much further, and we have due diligence in supply chains, we have it in national legislation. So this would be one way that you can hold corporations to account by having, by applying a due diligence approach. And this could be done also within the sphere of climate change and sustainability as well. As to whether that would actually end up providing us with more open and transparent economic relations in terms of corporations, that depends on the reporting. We've seen that again with business and human rights. It depends on the reporting technique, the materiality of the report, what goes into it, what is reported, and perhaps what you later discover that is not reported. There's a huge amount of work going on this, but this is the direction we're heading in, I think. Are there more questions perhaps from that you would like to pose, or from the floor?
Michelle, do you want to pose an additional question? I have one more, but I'll defer to you.
Okay, I'll have one. Just thinking about one of the core debates in the SIEL community that has been in the last years, the trade system and the WTO. So if we really think that global governance should be rethink, and but the WTO being part of that, and taking this as this notion of a geology of international law, that we get layers of regulation. How should we maybe think more about that layer of regulation at the WTO level to have a more positive regulation, to including those environmental concerns? We had a lot of panels on greening subsidies, on topics about how fisheries, what are the maybe a list of priorities that could lead us for a viable and effective discussion at the WTO level from your point of view, Mary?
Whoa, that's a very big question, Michelle. I think the biggest stumbling block still remains, and I wrote about this many years ago in my book, the fact that we have a member-driven organization. So we don't have a real, we have the fabric or the design of institutions. We have committees and councils and so forth, but the members are the driving force behind this, and it makes it very difficult. So probably the way to approach a change in governance at the WTO might be to actually look at, and I believe that the current Director General, Ngozi, she's doing this to some extent, is working more with other institutions, so trade and environment, or trade and COVID, World Health Organization, FAO. Possibly this might be a start, which would also open up the organization to potentially think about doing things in different ways. But having said that, it is difficult because you're dealing with a member-driven organization, and you're dealing with the extent to which Negotiations still play a very big role in any change. That probably has to end as well. And with a partially dysfunctional dispute settlement system, at least to the extent that the appeal system is not working. So there's a lot to work with within the organization. I don't actually think I have an immediate answer for this. And I think it probably is an area that needs far greater study, but I hope that I've managed to perhaps come up with a few ideas, but I don't think this is the last word. I think Dan is going to have the last word in a moment. Thank you.
Yeah, there's one audience question, since we don't leave any audience question. Boris Bikasdaski is saying that more trade equals more wealth of nations, and is wondering whether you can tell us how to implement this idea that the more trade you have, the better, I guess, for the wealth of nations and for people. And, you know, what's the right way to do that? And my just final reflection and thought, I enjoyed very much a discussion about disciplining fisheries subsidies, the fossil fuel subsidies, and the various multi-institutional initiatives that are already being taken to get to either global or domestic green policy. One of the risks that's been identified, and you see this in the sovereign debt context in particular, you talked about the need for new facilities to deal with that type of crisis, is greenwashing. Everything is being relabeled, to speak to this issue, but may not necessarily be getting at what Professor Mary Futter wants to see done. And so I wonder whether you have any parting thoughts about that. And since this is the last time I will have my mic on, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture and great discussion.
Okay, I just will say a very brief word about, is more trade, the wealth of nations idea, more trade is better. Maybe, maybe not. In fact, I didn't have an opportunity to talk about the role of small and medium-sized enterprises, but there is a growing movement to consider about producing and consuming more locally, or within small regional groups. And of course, we have regional trade, but maybe the interaction between the domestic economy and the international economy could once again become more significant. I mean, this is a problem, by the way, that the European Union has grappled with, dealing with SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Why are they not involved in the trading system? Why is it just the big boys? Why is it just the very large exporters? And maybe, and of course, this would bring in many more small developing country exporters, I think, if those small and medium-sized enterprises were encouraged to export, and there was a framework in which they could operate and operate equally successfully as some of the very large exporters. That's one thing. But on the issue, your final point about doing things differently, I suppose. I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. I think I'll leave it here. But anyway, but thanks for your thoughts, and I hope I've tried to answer everything, and I hope that I've enjoyed talking to you. I've enjoyed the questions, the conversations with you, the questions from the floor. So I think I'll hand back to Dan at this point.
Thank you to you, Professor Futter, and thank you, Professor Gathii and Professor Ratton Sanchez Badin, for a very powerful and intelligent discussion. While we cannot hear the applause in this virtual platform, I think that we can all feel it. Percolating everything that has just been said in the last 90 minutes, I'm struck by the real and urgent need, or basket of needs, for practical and effective action, ideally multilateral action, to protect those who are most vulnerable and who are disproportionately affected by these international challenges that we've discussed. And in turn, the extremely difficult problem of how to address those needs through our instruments of international economic, trade, and investment law. The importance of this discourse today is very, very evident. So thank you to each of you once again. Thank you also to all of you in the audience for your participation and your support. A big thank you to the Live Expo coordinators, Elisa and Nicole, who have been working behind the scenes to ensure a smooth online experience for everyone. And before closing, I would also like to thank SIEL and Marcus Wagner for their excellent work in organizing the conference and in particular today's lecture. With that, I wish everyone an excellent evening. Good night to all.